Imagine living in a neighborhood where one person acts like the ultimate ruler, enforcing rules that don't even exist. That was Karen, the HOA's self-proclaimed enforcer, and she had her sights set on my truck. She threatened, she harassed, and she even called a tow truck. But what happened next will leave you stunned. This story takes a wild turn that Karen never saw coming, and trust me, it's a satisfying dose of karma you won't forget. Before we dive in, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss out on more unbelievable stories just like this one. You're not going to want to miss a second of this roller coaster. It was a bright Saturday morning, and I had just finished washing my truck, admiring how the sunlight glinted off the fresh coat of wax. My driveway was bustling with activity, kids playing down the street, neighbors trimming their hedges, but my peaceful moment didn't last long. The air was suddenly filled with the screeching sound of high heels stomping against the pavement. It was Karen, the self-proclaimed queen of the HOA. Karen wasn't just any HOA member, she took her role as the neighborhood enforcer far too seriously, wielding her clipboard like a badge of honor. Today, she had locked her eyes on me and my truck, as if I'd committed a heinous crime. "You know that oversized truck isn't allowed in the neighborhood," she barked, standing at the edge of my driveway. I turned to her, confused. "It's parked in my driveway. There's no rule against that," I replied calmly, though my patience was already being tested. But Karen wasn't one to back down easily. The HOA rules clearly state that no large vehicles should be visible from the street. Either park it somewhere else or I'll have it towed. Her voice carried that entitled tone that had become all too familiar to everyone in the neighborhood. I tried explaining that I'd lived here for years without a single complaint and that my truck had always been parked right where it was. But Karen wasn't interested in listening. She smirked, scribbled something onto her clipboard, and marched away, muttering about how she would take care of this herself. Little did she know, her own actions were about to spiral out of control in the most ironic way possible. The next morning, I woke up to a note taped to my front door. It was from Karen, written in bold, aggressive handwriting that practically screamed entitlement. The note read, "This is your final warning. Remove your truck or it will be towed at your expense. You have 24 hours. I stood there, holding the note, shaking my head in disbelief. My truck was fully registered, parked in my own driveway, and not violating any actual HOA rules. I couldn't understand why Karen was so determined to make my life difficult. Still, I decided to double-check the HOA guidelines. Flipping through the rule book, I found nothing that prohibited vehicles like mine in driveways. Feeling a mix of relief and frustration, I decided to stand my ground. If Karen thinks she can bully me, she's got another thing coming, I muttered to myself. Later that afternoon, I even took pictures of my truck in the driveway, just in case I needed proof that it wasn't blocking anything or breaking any rules. But Karen wasn't done yet. That evening, as I was relaxing on my porch, I noticed a tow truck slowly cruising down the street. My stomach dropped. Sure enough, Karen was right behind it, walking with her usual clipboard in hand and an air of a smug satisfaction. She pointed toward my driveway, gesturing for the driver to come closer. I stood up immediately and marched toward her. "What do you think you're doing, Karen?" I demanded, my voice firm. Karen smirked, tapping her pen against the clipboard. "I told you I'd take care of it. This truck is an eyesore and violates our community standards. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Karen, this is my property. My truck is legally parked in my driveway, and it's not against any HOA rules, I exclaimed, my frustration boiling over. The tow truck driver hesitated, glancing at me and then back at Karen, clearly unsure about the situation. Ma'am, he said cautiously, I can't tow this vehicle unless it's violating the law or a specific rules. Do you have proof this is unauthorized? Karen, flustered but not backing down, flipped through the HOA rule book she always carried, her confidence wavering. Oh, I don't need proof, she snapped, her tone sharp. I am the proof. I've been on this board for years. I know what's acceptable and what isn't. The driver crossed his arms, unimpressed. Lady, if you don't have a written complaint or legal documentation, I'm not risking my job towing this guy's truck. Karen's face turned red with fury, and she began hurling accusations, calling me uncooperative and a nuisance to the neighborhood. I just stood there, arms crossed, refusing to budge. Finally, the tow truck driver shrugged, got back into his vehicle, and drove off, leaving Karen fuming on the sidewalk. This isn't over, she hissed, jabbing a finger in my direction, before storming back to her house. I shook my head, thinking the ordeal was over. But as I was about to find out, Karen was cooking up something even more outrageous, and this time it would backfire spectacularly. The following day, I noticed Karen pacing up and down the street, her phone glued to her ear. She looked frantic but determined, as though plotting her next move. I ignored her for the most part, figuring she'd eventually get tired of trying to control everyone's lives. But later that afternoon, I heard a loud banging on my door. I opened it to find Karen standing there with two other HOA board members, both looking uncomfortable but clearly dragged into her drama. Good afternoon, Karen said, with a fake smile that barely hid her frustration. We've come to discuss your blatant disregard for our community's standards. One of the board members, a kind elderly man named Mr. Thompson, stepped forward, holding a copy of the HOA rulebook. We've reviewed the rules, he said gently, and technically your truck isn't in violation. However, Karen has raised concerns about its size being a potential safety issue. I sighed, realizing this was just another baseless excuse. Safety issue? It's a regular pickup truck parked in my driveway, I said, trying to keep my cool. Karen interrupted, her voice dripping with sarcasm. Oh sure, because oversized vehicles never block views or create hazards. Before I could respond, Mr. Thompson cut in. Karen, we've already determined there's no clear violation. I don't think we can pursue this further. Karen's face twisted in anger. Fine, she spat, turning to leave. But don't blame me when the community starts complaining. Little did she know her relentless campaign was about to take a surprising turn, one that she wouldn't see coming. That evening, I sat on my porch, trying to unwind from the day's chaos. The air was cool, and the neighborhood seemed calm for the first time in a while. But of course, peace never lasted long when Karen was involved. Suddenly, I saw her stomping toward her car, which was parked in front of her house on the street, a spot she often claimed was her personal space. She was on the phone, yelling at someone, her words carrying through the quiet evening air. I overheard bits of her rant. This is unacceptable. I'm the one enforcing these rules, and they're treating me like the problem, she fumed. I chuckled to myself, shaking my head at her dramatics. As I watched, Karen got into her car and slammed the door. But then something caught my eye. A city parking enforcement officer was walking toward her car, clipboard in hand. Karen's car had been parked there for days without being moved, and the officer had clearly taken notice. Karen stepped out of her car, her face a mix of confusion and outrage. "Excuse me, what are you doing?" she demanded. The officer, unfazed, calmly explained that her car was violating local street parking regulations. Apparently, there was a 72-hour rule for the street parking, and Karen had conveniently ignored it. "This is my neighborhood," she snapped, crossing her arms. "I'm on the HOA board and I have the right to park here." But the officer wasn't having it. "Rules apply to everyone, ma'am," he said firmly. Karen's face turned beet red as the officer began filling out a citation. It was only the beginning of her troubles. Karen's frustration only grew as the officer continued writing the ticket. She tried everything, arguing, pleading, and even claiming she was just about to move her car. The officer didn't buy it. "Ma'am, your car has been parked here longer than the allowed time, and the rules are clear. This ticket isn't negotiable," he said firmly. Karen's voice rose with indignation. "You're targeting me. Do you even know who I am? I'm the head of this HOA," she shouted, as if her title gave her immunity from basic regulations. The officer, clearly unimpressed, responded calmly, "I don't care if you're the mayor. The rules are the rules." Karen was visibly fuming, but just as she reached to snatch the ticket from his hand, things went from bad to worse. Another tow truck rounded the corner, this time called in by the city to deal with abandoned or improperly parked vehicles. The officer had reported Karen's car earlier in the day after receiving complaints from neighbors about her monopolizing the street parking. Karen's jaw dropped. "You can't tow my car. I'm an HOA board member," she screeched. But the tow truck driver ignored her protests and got to work. The irony was almost too sweet. After all her threats to have my truck towed, it was her own car that was being hauled away. A small crowd of neighbors had gathered by now, watching the spectacle unfold. Some of them were clearly holding back laughter, while others whispered to each other, shaking their heads at Karen's antics. Karen's reaction was nothing short of theatrical. She ran after the tow truck, waving her arms and shouting, "You can't do this. This is my car, my neighborhood." The driver, unbothered, secured her vehicle and prepared to leave. "Ma'am," the parking officer interjected, "your car will be impounded until you pay the citation and the towing fees. You can contact the impound lot for further details." Karen looked like she might explode. Her entitled attitude had finally met a force she couldn't manipulate or intimidate. The crowd of neighbors began murmuring louder, and I couldn't help but smile from my porch. For years, Karen had terrorized the neighborhood with her petty rules and constant harassment, and now she was getting a taste of her own medicine. A few of the braver neighbors even started clapping as the tow truck pulled away, with Karen's car in tow. She turned toward the crowd, her face beet red, and snapped, "What are you all laughing at? This isn't funny. I'm doing this for the good of the community." But no one bought her excuse. "Oh, sure," one neighbor quipped, "because breaking your own rules is so good for the community." Karen stormed off, muttering angrily to herself, and slammed her front door so hard that her house seemed to shake. It felt like the neighborhood had finally gotten a small but satisfying victory. But for Karen, this was far from the end. Little did she know her actions had triggered a chain reaction that was about to make her life even more complicated. Over the next few days, the story of Karen's car getting impounded spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. People who had been quietly tolerating her antics for years were suddenly emboldened to speak up. Complaints about her power-hungry behavior flooded the HOA's official email and meetings. Karen, of course, tried to play the victim. She sent out a long-winded email to all the homeowners claiming she was being targeted and that the parking officer was out to get her. The email backfired spectacularly. Instead of garnering sympathy, it only fueled the neighbors' frustration. Many pointed out how she had gone out of her way to enforce rules that didn't even exist, harassing people over minor issues while blatantly ignoring her own violations. One neighbor even shared a story about how Karen had once threatened to fine them for having a garden gnome in their yard, calling it an eyesore. Another recounted how she had berated their teenage son for parking his bike too close to the sidewalk. The HOA board decided to hold an emergency meeting to address the growing number of complaints. Karen, desperate to save face, tried to frame herself as the hero of the community, claiming that her actions were necessary to maintain order. But the board members, including Mr. Thompson, weren't buying it. Karen, he said firmly during the meeting, your role is to represent the community, not to impose your personal preferences. You've overstepped your authority, and it's become a problem. Karen's face twisted in indignation, but the writing was on the wall. Her reign of terror was crumbling around her. As the emergency HOA meeting continued, Karen's composure began to unravel. I have dedicated years to this community, she shouted, her voice quivering. Everything I've done was to uphold the standards and make this neighborhood better. But the room remained silent, apart from a few awkward coughs. The neighbors weren't buying her self-righteous speech anymore. One homeowner, Mrs. Garcia, stood up and calmly said, Karen, we all know the difference between maintaining standards and bullying. What you've been doing is bullying. Several others nodded in agreement. You've fined people for no reason, you've harassed anyone who doesn't follow your personal preferences, and now you've even brought a tow truck to someone's private property over a truck that wasn't breaking any rules, another neighbor added. Karen's face flushed as she tried to regain control of the situation, but the momentum had shifted. Even her usual allies on the board seemed hesitant to defend her this time. Then came the final blow. Mr. Thompson pulled out a folder and began reading complaints from various homeowners detailing Karen's history of overreach and abuse of power. We've also reviewed your actions over the past year, and it's clear you've been acting outside of your authority, he said. The HOA is a collective effort, not a dictatorship. Effective immediately, we're voting on whether you should remain on the board. Karen's mouth fell open in shock. This was the last thing she had expected. Karen's jaw tightened as the room erupted into murmurs. You can't do this, she stammered, gripping the edge of the table in front of her. I've done more for this neighborhood than any of you ever will. Her voice cracked under the weight of desperation, but the board and the neighbors had made up their minds. Mr. Thompson raised his hand to silence the room and said calmly, Karen, this isn't personal. It's about accountability. The HOA was designed to serve the community, not your personal interests. The vote began, and it was clear from the start that Karen's time was up. Hand after hand shot up in favor of her removal. Even the neighbors, who usually stayed out of HOA politics, participated, clearly fed up with her antics. Out of 20 votes, 18 were cast against her. Karen glared around the room, her expression a mix of betrayal and rage. Only one person voted to keep her on the board, and it was Karen herself. The final vote sealed her fate. Karen shot up from her chair, slamming her clipboard onto the table. "Fine," she yelled. "If you all think you can do a better job, go ahead and try. Don't come crying to me when everything falls apart." She'd stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind her. The neighbors exchanged relieved glances, and for the first time in years, the atmosphere in the room felt lighter. As people began to leave, I caught a few whispering about how nice it would be to finally enjoy their homes without Karen breathing down their necks. For the next few weeks, the neighborhood felt like a completely different place. Without Karen patrolling the streets or handing out bogus citations, there was a sense of relief among the residents. People started chatting with each other more, hosting small gatherings, and even making light jokes about the former HOA queen. It was clear that Karen's reign of terror had left a lasting impression, but now the neighborhood was beginning to heal. Karen, however, was not one to take her removal quietly. She retreated to her home, but was often seen glaring out of her window or stomping around her yard. Occasionally, she would still send out emails to the HOA members, accusing them of ruining the neighborhood and threatening to take legal action. Of course, none of her threats amounted to anything, and most of her emails were met with eye rolls or deleted without being read. It was as if she was trying to cling to the power she once had, but no one was willing to entertain her anymore. Then, in a final attempt to assert her authority, Karen decided to lodge a complaint with the city about alleged neighborhood violations. She accused multiple residents of everything from unkempt lawns to unapproved renovations, but her efforts backfired yet again. A city inspector came out to investigate, only to find that Karen herself had violated several local ordinances with her oversized shed and unpermitted backyard modifications. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Karen had spent years harassing her neighbors over rules, only to be caught breaking some herself. The city inspector's visit became the final nail in Karen's coffin. When the inspector left, she was issued several fines for her violations, including the unpermitted shed and an illegal extension to her backyard patio. Neighbors who heard the news couldn't help but laugh at the poetic justice. Karen, the self-proclaimed enforcer of rules, had become the biggest violator of them all. It was almost too perfect. But Karen didn't take the news gracefully. Instead, she began another round of tantrums, complaining to anyone who would listen about how unfair the fines were. "This is a personal attack," she ranted to anyone who passed her house. "They're punishing me for trying to make this neighborhood better." Yet no one seemed to sympathize anymore. In fact, her constant whining only alienated her further. Most of the neighbors avoided her entirely, not wanting to get caught up in her endless drama. Meanwhile, the HOA thrived without Karen. The new leadership made efforts to rebuild trust with the community. They relaxed unnecessary rules and prioritized addressing real concerns like fixing potholes and improving a street lighting. The neighborhood felt alive again, as though Karen's absence had lifted a heavy cloud. Even I noticed how much more relaxed I felt, not having to look over my shoulder, wondering what petty rule Karen might try to enforce next. As the neighborhood continued to move on from Karen's reign, something unexpected happened. She became more reclusive than ever. Her once meticulously maintained front yard began to show signs of neglect, with weeds creeping up through the cracks in the driveway and her once pristine flower beds drying out. It was a stark contrast to the Karen who had once fined a neighbor for letting their grass grow half an inch too tall. People joked that her lawn had become the new eyesore of the community. Despite her isolation, Karen couldn't completely let go of her old habits. One afternoon, I caught her peeking through her blinds, watching me as I parked my truck in the driveway. I smirked and waved at her just to see her reaction. She quickly closed the blinds, but not before I saw the look of frustration on her face. It was clear that losing her position of power still stung, especially since she no longer had any authority to bother me about my truck, or anyone else about anything, for that matter. However, her downfall wasn't just satisfying for me. It was a wake-up call for the entire community. People began to realize just how much control Karen had been allowed to exert over the years, and they became more involved in HOA decisions to ensure no one else could abuse the system like she had. In an ironic twist, Karen's downfall actually brought the neighborhood closer together. It felt like everyone had finally united against a common problem: her. Karen's decline continued as she tried one last desperate attempt to claw her way back into the HOA. She submitted a formal request to be reinstated, arguing in a lengthy letter that the neighborhood needed her leadership to restore order. The letter was riddled with exaggerations about how the community was falling apart without her and how she had been wrongfully removed. It was laughable, and the HOA board didn't take long to reject her request. When the news of her failed reinstatement spread, Karen's fury was palpable. She started leaving passive-aggressive notes in mailboxes, accusing neighbors of not following the rules and threatening to report them. One neighbor, Mr. Parker, who lived directly across from Karen, found a note taped to his door about his improperly placed trash bins. Instead of complying, Mr. Parker took the note and pinned it on Karen's mailbox with a message of his own: "We don't take orders from you anymore." The bold act from Mr. Parker inspired others in the community to stand their ground against Karen's lingering antics. Her notes were either ignored or turned into neighborhood jokes. Karen's threats no longer held any weight, and she slowly realized that her control over the neighborhood was officially gone. It was clear to everyone, including Karen herself, that her time as the HOA's self-appointed dictator was truly over. But while Karen simmered in her frustration, the rest of us were finally at peace. With Karen officially out of power and her attempts to regain control failing miserably, she began to retreat further into her own bubble. It was as if she couldn't bear to face the community she had once ruled with an iron fist. She stopped showing up to neighborhood events and was rarely seen outside her home except for quick trips to and from her car. Even her usual scowling surveillance from her front window became less frequent. The neighbors, on the other hand, were thriving. People were finally enjoying their homes without the constant fear of Karen's clipboard and her arbitrary enforcement of rules. Block parties became more common, with laughter and conversation filling the streets. One weekend, we held a community barbecue, and nearly everyone showed up, except Karen, of course. A few neighbors joked about sending her an invitation, but we all knew she'd never come. Still, Karen's absence didn't stop the occasional reminder of her. Every now and then, someone would share a story about her ridiculous behavior, like the time she tried to fine someone for having their holiday lights up too early, or when she once measured the length of a driveway crack to complain it violated aesthetic standards. These stories, once a source of frustration, now served as humorous reminders of what the community had overcome. Karen had become a cautionary tale, a symbol of how not to lead a neighborhood. Months later, Karen became little more than a memory of the neighborhood's chaotic past. Her once immaculate yard now looked almost abandoned, and the community hardly noticed her anymore. But one final twist brought everything full circle. One morning, a moving truck pulled up to Karen's house. Curious neighbors peeked through their windows as workers began loading furniture and boxes. Karen was moving out. She stood outside, arms crossed, watching the movers with a sour expression on her face. It was as if she was silently blaming the entire neighborhood for her downfall. A few neighbors stepped outside to watch, and while no one said anything directly to her, the collective sense of relief was palpable. Karen had finally admitted defeat. The woman who had spent years micromanaging the lives of others was leaving the very community she had tried to control. After she left, the neighborhood felt like it could finally breathe freely. No more clipboard, no more threats, no more drama. In her absence, the community flourished. The HOA became more transparent, neighbors grew closer, and the sense of camaraderie Karen had disrupted for years returned as stronger than ever. Her departure was a reminder of how important it is for a community to stand together against those who misuse their power. Karen's story became a legendary tale in the neighborhood, a reminder that entitlement and overreach never lead to true respect or community. Sometimes, the people who try to control everything end up losing it all. Message for readers, viewers. Always stand up for fairness and accountability, no matter how challenging it seems. True leadership isn't about control, it's about building trust and respect. Thank you for watching, and remember, the strength of a community lies in unity.